Hey there folks. So in the last video we worked towards creating our first game character. So if I press play, you can see that we will load in at that player start with this Synty polygon character here from the prototype pack. Obviously at the moment he's standing in his T-pose, he's not doing anything, and in this video what we're going to look at is how we can take inputs from the player, so from hardware like keyboards or gamepad, and pass them through to this character in order to make him move. Okay, so we're going to start by actually starting to create our enhanced input actions that will allow us to get messages from our keyboard or our gamepad and pass them through to our character. Now to do that, we're going to go into our content drawer, and in these folders here, I've got this blueprint folder. I could make another folder in here, maybe I'll start organizing things a little bit better, but for now I'm just going to create a new folder and call it inputs. And if we right click in here, you can see there's an input section. And we have a whole range of different actions. We've got this input action, which is going to listen for our key presses, and we've got this mapping context. And the idea here is that we assign actions to different keys, and the actual keys get assigned in here. We can change these mapping contexts as we're playing. So let's say we've got a bunch of actions like moving, looking around, jumping, and interacting. Obviously, they would be our normal mapping context, our human walking around interaction context. But what about if we get into a vehicle? Well, at that point, then we'll swap the mapping context and we'll use a whole different bunch of actions such as accelerate, brake, steer. And if we were to fall into water, then maybe we'd need to do stuff like dive and ascend and swim. So we'll make different mapping contexts for different purposes, and each of these input actions is basically a verb. It's an action, a thing that we're going to do. So we're going to start with those first, and we're going to have a bunch of easy ones to start with. We're going to go with IA underscore move, and I'm using IA to stand for input action, and it's going to be a movement one. If I double click on that and open it up, you're going to see we've got a whole bunch of different options in here. And I'm not going to go into enhanced input in too much depth. We'll do that in some separate videos. But for these ones, the first thing I need to think about is what kind of value is going to come through here. Now it defaults here to digital bool, so digital boolean. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to change this, and I'm going to change it to a axis 1D. Now this will allow me to have one float. So I can say this works on one axis. So a left axis to a right axis, or a forward to a back. Yeah. Now that would be fine if I was to make this like move right, and then I could have another action that is move forward. And those then would each individually be one axis. I could also go with just a generic move that contains everything, and that would be this vector 2D. And what a vector 2D is it's basically a combination of two floats together. So I'm going to get an X value and a Y value. So I'm going to change that, and I'm going to do one move value that contains all of them, but know that you can break this apart and have one for right and left, and then one for up and down or forward backward. We do have some triggers and we have some modifiers. I'm not going to mess with those at the moment with the default action. We can change these in the mapping context, and that's where we're going to prefer to change them for now. But just note that as of 5.3 and 5.4 in Unreal going onwards, if you make any changes and override them in here, there'll be an option in the mapping context that says you can use the context that is assigned in here. You can use the triggers and modifiers, or you can choose to override it and change it in the mapping context itself. There's a whole bunch of different options that are available down here as well, in terms of allowing the player to map the controls, whether it will trigger and be allowed to be used while the game is paused, and also, whether it will consume things that are lower down in the order. And all these things are things we'll explore in different enhanced input videos. So we're just going to start with that for now. Now we've got an action, we're going to come over here back into our content browser, and we're going to right click, and under input, we're now going to create ourselves an input mapping context. I'm going to call this one IMC, and we'll just go with base movement, and we can always separate these later depending on what kind of context our character is going to have. And if I open this up, you'll see we have these mappings, so we can basically assign in these mappings an action that we've just created and then assign keys to it. If I go add to add a new mapping to there and expand it, I'll have this little drop down, and this drop down will give me access to all of the ones that are available in my project. Now what you can see is I've actually got some in here already, and they are because this project still, I'm just going to close this down for one sec, it still contains the third person content. So if you do add a third person top down character or anything like that to your project, In the third person folder or the first person folder, you'll find a folder called inputs. And inside there, you'll see that they have already created a mapping context and a bunch of actions. So just to make mine easy just for now, I'm just going to put demo or a number at the end, only so that if I'm here looking at this list, I can see which one is my specific move one. So I'll use that one there. But if you do want to learn about this a little bit more, you could go into the ones that already exist and you can go and have a look at how Epic have put these things together. Okay, so let's go back into our mapping context. Let's have a look at what we have available to us. If I expand this out, the first thing I'm going to see here is this little keyboard symbol and a drop down. And again, as I said, triggers and modifiers are able to be set in here. Now this thing here is actually looking for what key are we going to assign to this move action. So I can click on here and you can see we've got access to basically the whole of our keyboard. If we go on gamepad, you'll see there's lots of gamepad generic. Now, if you're looking at these thinking gamepad face button bottom, well, that's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for like an Xbox one, or I'm looking for a PlayStation or something. Those ones there are the ones that are specific to that controller, that console only. Whereas this gamepad one is referring to any console, any controller. So gamepad face button bottom is going to be contextualized based on the console that you're on. So if you are playing on an Xbox, then obviously the bottom button is going to be an A. If you're playing on a PlayStation, then it's going to be the X. So in this instance, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to set it up for keyboard. And what I could do is I could go into here and I could search for the key I want. I could type in the key I want. We've also got this listener here. So here, this select key value, if you click that, now it's listening for an input. And if I press a key, so I'm going to go with W, you can see that it actually auto assigns the key that has been pressed. If you have got a gamepad plugged in, you should be able to also press the buttons and find out what they are without having to search through that list. Now W works pretty well for me. I'm happy with W for that one. I'm going to also add myself another key, and this one's going to be S, because it's going to go forward and it's going to go backward. Now in this instance, we've got a value that's going to go up, and this is going to be a positive number. So it's actually going to come out as a positive 1. If we think about this as a scale value, this is going to be 1 to move forward. So if I want to make this move back, I want to make this into a negative 1. And that's where these modifiers come in. I can use this modifier to adapt that number that's coming out as this scale value. And you can see here, I've got the option to negate it. Now I can negate individual X, Y, Z, but for now, we'll just leave that as default. And that should mean that if I'm pressing W, this event is going to be triggering a 1, and this one, if I'm pressing and I'm pressing S, I'm going to get a negative 1 out of there. Now we will come back into here in a moment and we'll add a little bit more. We'll add an A and a D and expand it, but let's just go and have a look at that actually in practice. So what we're going to do now is we're going to jump into our character and our controller, and we're going to start actually putting some of these together so we can get a value out onto the screen and see that these things are working. Okay, so let's jump over to our character and our controller in order to start setting this up. Now I say character or controller because there's possibilities to do this in either of those two areas. So I'm just going to show you, there's a character here and there's also our controller. We've previously made these. If we see this, we can always go back to open full blueprint editor. It just means that there's nothing actually created in the event graph. So this has just reverted to default values. So we'll just open it up and you can see now I've got the controller and its event graph, and I've got the character and its event graph. Now we want to set up a mapping context right at the start, so when we start playing. So we've got our begin play here, and I'm just in the character. And what you might see on lots of tutorials is that we might start searching for our enhanced input subsystem. And you can see there's a whole bunch of different options here. We've got the enhanced input local player subsystem, but then we've got this one here that's going to come from the player controller local player subsystems. And then this one here, which is the world subsystems. So if I add these ones in, the world one, we don't want that because we're not actually referring to anything to do with our actual player character. So we think about where these things are coming from. Okay, and we can add in this top one. And you can see this one's a little bit better because it's the local player subsystem. It's referring to us as a player. And then the middle one, enhanced input subsystem, you can see it's exactly the same as the one above it, but it has this input here. And this input, if I hover over it, it says it's looking for a player character, player controller. So we can get rid of that world one for a moment and we have a look at these two. Now, as I said, lots of tutorials will show you using this one here, but we need a reference to our player controller. So you've got two options for this. What you could do is you could say, well, I'm going to use this one and I can get player controller, and that will tell me which player controller is currently being used in my game. There you go. That's going to give me the current player controller, and that's what's looking for. And that would be fine. That would mean that, you know, I can access something in the player controller, get the system, and then set things inside of that system, inside of that controller. But this one here doesn't need to look for a player controller, because this one actually wants to happen inside of the player controller itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to prefer to take this and I'm going to go into my player controller and I'm going to use that one there inside of the player controller, because this one doesn't need the input. If we had the input in this one, we'd just be essentially typing in and looking for self, because I don't need to go and look for the player controller. Now, one thing I do like to do is just check if this is valid, just because, you know, if there isn't an actual player subsystem working, we can throw out, make sure there's no errors from that. And then I'm going to go to add mapping context. And that's going to allow me to take that IMC underscore mapping context that I previously created. And you can see that one, I haven't actually saved it yet. So there's my movement one. And I can assign that to my controller. And that means that my controller now is listening and looking at that mapping context. And depending on what keys have been set up on here, that will trigger different input actions in the possessed character or wherever those events are going to be. Because we can actually put input action events inside of a whole range of different places. We can put them inside of the controller, we can put them in the character, we can even put them in places like UI. Okay, so that covers everything on that and how to add a mapping context. The only thing I'll just show you here is if we do search for mapping, there's a whole bunch of other options we have, such as clear all mapping, so we can remove them. We can remove specific mappings, so we can remove a mapping context and tell it which one to do. So maybe if we were to, you know, fall into the water, maybe we have to remove all of the mapping contexts and then add the water mapping context. Or maybe we add a mapping context when we're in combat and we add it with a higher priority so that it appears over the other ones and it overrides with the keys of what's being used. Okay, so that is our controller setup. Our controller is now set up to use that mapping context. Now what we'll do is we'll jump back to our base character and we're going to search for enhanced input. And we're going to search for event, because there's a difference here between events and action values. So here, I know that my event is called move. You know, if I was to just search for move, we'll see there's two options. We've got IA underscore move and IA underscore move, but this one here is the value and this one here is the event. So the event is what actually gets triggered and happens when we press the key or when we hold the key or when we release the key. Whereas this one just gives us the value. So in our case, with what we've got with a vector 2D, it will just let me know what that vector 2D equals while we're playing the game, which could be, you know, a Boolean of true or false. Is this key down, yes or no? So here I'm going to go over to the one that we got, which is move demo. And we want to have a look at all these different options. And as I said, in another enhanced input video, we'll go through what each of these is. But we want to think, first of all, when do we want to actually trigger movement? Well, we want to trigger movement every single frame that this key is being pressed down. So I'm going to use this triggered event here, and I'm going to use this to, for now, print out a string. And I'm going to use it to tell me, what does this action value equal? Now, the action value, I can't really put it, I can put it into there, but I can't really get much out of it in terms of what's X and what's Y yet. And we want to start having a look at that. So here, you can see I've got 1 and 0, and in this one, -1 and 0. But that's coming through the X, yeah? And if we're thinking about X as our sideways movement and Y as our forward and backward movement, well, we know that this is wrong. So what we actually need to do is over here in our mapping context, we have to think about W and S, how do we actually get them to work with our Y value instead? Because our keys on our keyboard will automatically use that first value. They'll always default to using X. And that actually comes from another modifier. So this other modifier here, if I go in here and add it in, is going to be one called swizzle input axis values. And if I expand that out, what you can see, it already does it by default. it just turns over the X and Y in the ordering, so that this one, instead of feeding this value through as the X value, it will instead feed this one through as the Y value, which is obviously perfect for our forward and backward movement. So I'm going to add that to both of my forward and backwards, and I'm also going to add 2 more mapping context input action things here. So one of them here is going to be A, and this one's going to be D. I can leave those pretty much as they are because I don't need to do the swizzle input. They're already going to be working on X. But we want A to be to the left. So for that one, we want it to be a -1. So we'll go with negate. And this one here, we want it to just be to the right and be a 1. So let's just save that. And it's as easy as just testing those things, putting those things on. And now if I go back into my game and press play, if I press W, now you can see W is a 1. If I press S, it's Y is -1. If I press D, it's +1 on the X, and if I press A, it's -1 on the X. And obviously I can press combinations of those, which will give me forwards, backwards, left and right. Okay, so now we've got the enhanced input passing our character some values. What we're going to do is we're going to actually jump into our character. I'm going to go blueprint characters and find my base character. We're going to give our character some input. So rather than just printing out what this value over here actually is, what we're going to do instead is actually start looking at how do we make our character move around. So, you know, when we press a key, how do I make them move left, move right? How do I make them move forward and backward? Now, remember, our character inherits from pawn, and all pawns have a node that they can do, which is called add movement input. And what this does is it targets, so you can see here, targets a pawn, so a thing that we're in possession of, which doesn't have to be a character. It could be a vehicle, it could be an inanimate object that we've taken control of. It gives it a world direction, so which way do we want this to be pushed in, and we can use this scale value as a kind of like a multiplier. Think about if it's 1, it's going to be forward on the X, or maybe -1 would be backwards on the X, you know, because a negative number is going to go in the opposite direction. So what we're going to do is we're going to use add movement input, and we're going to use that to move us around. Now this here, this vector 2D structure, remember we talked about structures actually contain multiple values, and the vector 2D here actually is 2 float values. So what I'm going to do, you can either right click it and split it, and you can see here that gives you the X and the Y, or you can drag it out and you can break it. It's not really going to make much difference which one you do here, just know that you can have that option. And I'm going to take this and I'm going to say, well, how do I take this X value for making me move left and right and put it into here? Well, that's just going to be my scale value. We've just seen when we're testing this out, we can go forward and X is 1. And when we move backwards, when we're pressing S, that's going to make it a -1. So any value that we're putting in here is going to obviously be multiplied by that. Now, if this was a simple side scroller game, maybe this would be very easy because, you know, I could look at this world direction. I could look down at this map right down here. So X is pointing to the right. If I wanted the character to be on a side scroll and move away along here, well then an X of 1 here would just say move in the X direction. But a 3D character in a 3D world is going to be constantly moving around, looking in different directions. So what is right to that character, what is forward to that character, is going to be constantly changing. So what we're going to do is we're going to go and get control rotation. And this is a value that looks at the pawn. And we're going to use this to work out which which direction our character's actually going in, or our pawn's actually going in right now. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually split this one to give me the roll, pitch and yaw, because I don't need all 3 of these values for this. I just need to know certain ones for making it move around. And I'm going to get the right vector. So I'm going to get right vector. If you can't see it, just type it in without anything being dragged off of. And we want this top one here. We're not looking for the get right vector of any of the individual components. We want the get right vector for the main actual actor itself. So we split that and we can say, let's take the X and the Z, leave the Y, because the Y, the pitch is us looking up and down. So we're looking which way we're facing when it comes to rotating the character. as they move around the world and not actually looking up and down. And we put that into our world direction. Let's just go and test this one out. If we press play and just see, I'm going to press D to move to the right and A to move to the left. Nothing at the moment for W and S, but we do have left and right. Just a quick test to do here. If you are pressing A and it's not going to the left, it's going to the right, just make sure you've got negate on the right modifier in the right enhanced input. So let's just go and have a look at the next one. We've got ourselves moving left and right. What about if we want to move forward? Well, moving forward, we're just going to duplicate. So I just did a Control D there and just duplicate this add movement input because we want to do that again. But this time we're going to use the Y value of our break vector and we're going to put it into here. So I'm just going to move this details panel over a little bit just to give us a little bit of space to show that. I'm going to double click the line, which gives me a reroute node so I can keep this nice and tidy. Always useful to keep your blueprint tidy. And this one, when we're looking at it, we do want to get the control rotation, but this time instead of getting the right vector, what we want to do is we want to get the forward vector. So we want to know what is forward to our character. Again, not the ones with the component in the brackets. We don't need to know what the forward vector of those is. We don't need to know what the actor's forward vector. We just want to do some math to get the forward vector. And I'm going to split this one here. And this time, all I'm going to use to find out what forward is just the Z value. So if I put that into there, give it a little bit of space, and that, I'll just leave that there. There you go. So we're going to get the right vector, and we're going to use that with the multiplier of X to work out how do we move left and right. We're going to get our forward vector just from the Z, and we're going to use that to work out from our Y, so our W and S, to make us move forward. Okay, so we come in here and we can now move right with D, left with A, forward with W, and backward with S. Now obviously there's a lot more controls that we need to be setting up with this, and in future videos we're going to look at how to set up the actual rotational values so we can look around with our mouse. And in the next video, we're also going to have a look at how we can set up jumping and how jumping might work. And we're separating that off into a separate video just so we can look at some of the really important values that we have for jumping and a key event linked to that. But for now, our character is moving around left, right, forward and backward. Perfect. Thanks for watching, folks. If you enjoyed this video, then please consider subscribing to access more of my Unreal Engine content.